for Bruce Brown, the Raptors are looking for a first-round pick as well, and maybe even more. And I think they're going to have a long list of teams that are interested. The teams that come up the most for me have been the Lakers, the Knicks. I think the Knicks and Bruce Brown make perfect sense for each other. He fits. I mean, he might be like one of another thing that the Knicks have, but like they already have a bunch of 6'4", 6'5" switchable dogs who just are all over the Madison Square Garden floor. And I think he'd fit in really, really well with what Tom Thibodeau likes to do there. I also would be curious to see if Milwaukee does decide that Bobby Portis is a necessary sacrifice to make in their quest to upgrade on their perimeter defense. I don't think they have.
Man.
I mean, they don't have the same level of draft capital that New York has, or even that the Lakers have. But the Bucks, to my understanding, are like very, very actively and aggressively shopping to find perimeter defensive upgrades. And there might not be anyone better who's actually available than Bruce Brown.
From Yahoo Sports, and the author of Built to Lose, How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League Forever. He is Jake Fischer. It's a big week for you, Jake, with the trade deadline. How are you doing?
It's a big week, but I don't. My head doesn't deserve to be twice the size as your guys' heads. Like, Adam is without a doubt the best pickup player I know in the NBA media who is not a former NBA player. And Legs, I don't know. You definitely don't remember this. I came up to you probably 15 years ago, 20 years ago in the Sixers family section where my dad had season tickets and been watching you on ESPN forever, man. So my head does not deserve to be twice the size.
Good. No, I'm glad you brought it up. I was like, hopefully he's going to say I was nice. I was nice to him.
You definitely were. I remember like throwing trade deadline thoughts at you and you not batting them away because I was like a 12-year-old idiot. So I appreciate your consciousness.
Perfect,
not consciousness, but graciousness. Yeah.
Very good. Well, good to be talking to you again.
Sure, it would be hilarious if you came in, Jake, and were like, I met you 20 years ago. Total jerk. Like, it just completely blew me off as a kid. That would have made a better story, I think.
I don't think you could have the success that Lex has had not treating people well in this business. So there you go.
Very, very true. We're going to get into a bunch of trade deadline buzz. Also talk a little bit about his book, which is very interesting and I think pertinent to some of the stuff going on in the NBA. But first, we're presented by DraftKings Fantasy Sports. Check out what DraftKings has to offer this season with code ALLNBA because life's more fun when you're in on the action. DraftKings, the crown is yours. If you have a gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER. Age and eligibility restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. See DraftKings.com for details. So I want to start. If you could pull it up, Emma, your book, Built to Lose, which came out last year, how the NBA's tanking era changed the league forever. And I wanted to start here before we get into the trade stuff, because I think it plays in a little bit to what's going on in the NBA. The book primarily talks about the 76ers. They were the face of tanking, this whole idea of trust the process, longest view in the room, and so on and so forth. I feel like tanking has changed a little bit, and I'm curious if you feel tanking has gotten better or if it's gotten redirected since the book has been published, and in particular with the idea of the play-in, where now you almost get teams like the Lakers who seem to take the regular season less seriously. They're almost tanking in the middle, not to be terrible, but also not necessarily trying to be great. Do you feel like it's just moved around a little?
I do think the play-in tournament's been like a direct result of that era, of the fact that, what the Thunder did for a couple years and what Houston did for way, way longer than almost anybody, even like the Detroit losing streak of right now hasn't gotten any of the attention that I think Sam Hinkie's tenure did because they were so brazen about it. And it didn't, the league didn't like that it was leading SportsCenter. And I remember back at the time when I was at SB Nation, like Liberty Ballers, the Sixers blog was the number one traffic generator, like of all the teams. Like they don't want it to be like a top tier discussion point of what the NBA is doing and the business that's being conducted. I think like overall, the fact that the title race was at that point in time like so narrow. You had Miami, you had LeBron in Cleveland, you had Golden State. Like it was so clear that there was really no chance to win a title unless you had these generational type talents. And I think it's kind of been validated in the fact that the window for a championship has seemed to be kind of open for everybody, but like you still need one of those or a couple of those guys. If you don't have Nikola Jokic, if you don't have Giannis Antetokounmpo, Steph Curry did it again. Like none of those guys were picked in the top 5, but traditionally that's where those types of talents really are available. And the most direct route for any team to get them is obviously there. So it's interesting to see how I think the play into your point that its direct mechanism was to try to dissuade teams from tanking, but also to bring it back to the trade deadline and to task. It's had as big an impact as anything on the NBA, being that so many teams, to your point, aren't willing to sell anymore because they think they still have a shot. But that rise of analytical minded thinking from Sam Hinkie to Pete D'Alessandro to Ryan McDonough to Rob Hennigan in Orlando to Danny Ainge front office in Boston, like that's permeated the league to the point where we're having these super wonky cap conversations around this time of year.
Well, Jake, to me, I look at the league and I think, we would categorize them by haves and have-nots. It seemed like for a long time. And the have-nots were those teams that would understand they weren't in that category to compete. So then they strip it down. They go into tanking. They try to get a high pick and then try to do it that way. It feels like there's like almost a third category now. I think there's like kind of haves, right? I think there are a lot of teams that have maybe one young star on their team, maybe a pretty good secondary player that probably should be a third best player that would make you something, more competitive. And I feel like as a result, there are more teams in the mix or interesting, at least to me, that I want to watch every night because I don't think they're that far off. And so to that point, it seems like that would mean that some of these veteran guys that their names have been, coming up all year that could be available at the trade deadline would be guys that might fit the bill for some of the teams I'm talking about that are in that middle tier. But I correct me if I'm wrong, but I get the impression that you might think, some of the noise around some of these guys is just not going to happen. So let's start with some of these guys. I want to talk about Zach LaVine because that started right at the beginning of the year. Like right off the bat, they're having a team meeting opening night, and you're like, wow, the Bulls are in trouble, mess. LaVine's name comes up. Then he doesn't play for a while. They start winning. They kind of turn around their fortunes this year. Where are we with Zach LaVine in terms of how the Bulls view him? And if you think it's possible somebody makes a run at him, who is the most likely to get into the mix for him?
At this point, especially now that he's having another season-ending surgery, which think back to the first ACL and a bunch of other stuff in between, I think that coupled by the long-term salary and the massive dollar figure that's going to come every single year, and the fact that he has never really proven to be capable of driving winning on his own. Sure, could he be maybe differently cast as a number 3 option somewhere else, to your point, Legs, and have much more success? Without a doubt. I mean, very different situations, but look at just what the injection of OG Anunoby has done in New York, for example, how different context around a lot of these guys can be much different from the standpoint of winning. But I think with Zach, the word had been pretty consistent that there wasn't much interest in him around the league for what the Bulls were looking back for his overall resume, if you will. The last thing we had heard about was with Detroit, where I definitely got word of a lot of different packages or ideas or concepts, whatever you want to call it, and don't really think they were. I mean, as I said on our show this morning, that's going to come out later today with Vinny Goodwill. Like, I can't put it on a certain yard line. It's hard to pick a barometer for that, but like they definitely got past the 50 and had conversations with Detroit. But I think after this injury, from what my understanding, it seems almost guaranteed he's not going to get moved right now.
What about the rest of the roster? Because to me, his injury signaled, okay, what are you doing with DeRozan? Caruso, obviously, I imagine a lot of teams are interested in Caruso, but even DeRozan, Vucevic, the Bulls are always so reluctant to hit the reset button, but this feels like God telling them to hit the reset button and go ahead and do this. Is there any movement? Do you get the sense that maybe Chicago is finally arriving at that point that it's time to try to recoup what you can from the remaining of that core?
It sounds like they're definitely going to listen. The thing with Chicago has always just been they're going to hold their price firm. And I think with Alex Caruso, for example, he's going to have and will have and has had by far the widest market of any player on the roster, where, I mean, he's going to go for much higher than what like Milwaukee can give, for example. But like the Bucks would love to snap their fingers and turn the second round pick they have and campaign and Pat Connaughton, I'm sure, you go down the list, how many teams would love to add Alex Caruso into the mix for not that much of a price point? But because of that, like, is he really worth a Drew Holiday type package? Now, you're not going to have to send out as much salary, but it's definitely like 2 first-round picks and then some seems to be the price there. So I don't know if he's really going to actually change teams there, but that doesn't mean there's not a shortage of interest in teams who are going to try. With DeMar, the fact that he's expiring, you would think, okay, there's a really strong chance he could just walk out the door for nothing. And even though he's not a Fred VanVleet to Toronto or a Pascal Siakam to Toronto, you're right. You would think that Chicago will figure out, or at least try to look to figure out ways to get something back in return for someone who they gave up a first-round pick and then more to get back in the 2021 summer. So I don't know exactly where that landing spot could be because his salary number is still pretty high. We heard some flirtation stuff with the Lakers and Miami. The Heat, I think, are kind of ruled out after getting Terry Rozier. The Sixers, I think, have always kind of rebuffed the idea that they're a DeMar DeRozan team. So I that's one of the things I'm trying to figure out as the week goes on is a real market for him. But for now, I think is more of an idea than like someone who's got lined up suitors ready to make an offer.
All right, let's move on to another guard. And one of the reasons I think Caruso is so interesting to so many teams because this league has become increasingly porous defensively on the perimeter. The rules set it up that way. It's a lot harder to guard guys. And in a league where more guys, I think, use that as a little bit of an excuse now to not have to guard because it's a trade basket mentality, Caruso still gets into you and gets after it and fights over picks and likes to do all that stuff. Another guard that actually made a name for himself in this league first defensively is DeJounte Murray. And I look at his name comes up a lot. And I look at Atlanta, and I think they're probably looking at that situation and saying this just isn't necessarily a winning combination. Those two guards together. Trae Young is your face of your franchise. He's your market. He's not going anywhere. So DeJounte Murray becomes interesting. Anybody out there you think looking at him as a real game changer for them? And if so, who would that be? And what's the price tag for a guy like DeJounte Murray? And is Atlanta seriously considering breaking those two guys up?
They're definitely seriously considering it. I think it's a matter of who can actually meet their price, which I've heard it's 2 first-round picks. And then they really want a legitimate player back too. I think the player might even be more of like importance to Atlanta because the Hawks aren't looking at this as let's just trade DeJounte and start a rebuild around Trae and Jalen Johnson. They're saying, how can we shake this deck up and add to Trae Young and Jalen Johnson? I think the draft pick capital is really just about the stakes of trading someone at that level of talent and the fact that they sent 3 out the door. So I've only been able to pinpoint offers from the Lakers and Jazz. That's not to say there hasn't been others to emerge, but those are the only 2 I've been able to confirm. But at this point, and the Hawks have kind of been signaling this across the league all along, I do think that there really is a strong chance they keep him after all this. The Hawks have won 4 straight now, and it doesn't seem like they really have the price point that they want. And historically, they did this 2 years in a row with John Collins, if you recall. They put him out there him out there, and nothing ever materialized. And it's not just Atlanta. A lot of teams around the league are looking at the new CBA landscape and looking at the challenges that come for salary matching purposes for teams above the apron, plus the fact that this summer teams like the Lakers are going to have access to 2 more picks. The Bucks don't have a first-round pick to trade, for example, right now. There could be a lot more teams with a lot more draft capital to play with for DeJounte Murray come draft time than right now.
It's such a perfect example of what we were just talking about with regards to the play-in because they're both the 10 seed, Atlanta and Utah. Utah is rising, Atlanta is falling, but when you talk about maybe Atlanta holds on to them, they're almost viewing themselves as the same. I don't think they are. Atlanta seems to have reached who they are going to be, whereas Utah is clearly in the first stages of discovering who they're going to be. So that's an interesting dynamic. I want to ask, though, the big news of the weekend was Joel Embiid, possibly out for the year, certainly out for a long time. They were one of the most interesting teams in the trade market, I thought, coming into it. Bruce Brown, maybe even Caruso. Do you get the sense that this injury is going to change how they approach this trade deadline?
I think it has to, from the standpoint of you're no longer going to be adding someone who's playing next to Joel Embiid for the next 1 to 2 months.
Right.
Like that's just massive sample size to consider the fact that you're looking at, if you have a guy who like is on an expiring contract, you're really only going to have X amount of sample size to figure out how does he actually truly fit, not just on paper, but in reality next to Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid. I've always thought that Philly, though, regardless of, even before this, I thought they were going to be far more explorative than aggressive in terms of what's actually become available to them. Just being that the Sixers have always kind of harped on the fact they're going to have this massive amount of cap space this summer that, sure, Detroit will be able to match, but there's really no other contending team or team that has real legitimate contending aspirations when healthy that could really compete with the type of room Philly's going to have to either sign someone or to welcome someone via trade. So I think they've been willing to be more patient than I think Sixers fans probably would want them to be. And also maybe like the public perception is, just because they kind of have this fallback plan if guys they really prefer and want aren't there right now. And they're really, really, really going to make sure that they don't kind of just the expression coming to mind is not the most, I don't know. They don't want to like burn a hole. They don't feel like they're burning a hole in their pocket with these picks in the cap space. They don't want to spend it on the wrong fit and have buyer's remorse. I think they're going to be more concerned about making sure it's like a bullseye when they throw a dart and not just like throw it and hope it lands somewhere close.
Jake, I'm looking at the Western Conference. It's kind of a strange year because you got Oklahoma City and Minnesota there at the top. And yet you've got all these teams. And look, it might not end up that way. As hot as the Clippers are, Denver's right there. I mean, who knows what that top 4 seeding will look like. But still, these two teams are there at the top of the West. And are they in a situation where they're still trying to figure out, like, how good are we, particularly Oklahoma City, with this super young core that they have? They have one, legitimate big-time star, great role definition around Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Are they still trying to kind of gauge, like, how good are we by letting them have a postseason run as currently constructed? Or do you think they're looking at the West and saying, yeah, this is really nice, but we also know, look at the star power at the top of these other rosters, and some of them are kind of still figuring themselves out. We're not good enough to contend or win a title this year. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to do something else and add something to our team. Where do you think the mentality is internally with the way Oklahoma City views themselves?
If OKC takes Davis Bertans' salary and a first and just upgrades with like a real backup center to supplant Chet minutes or when he gets in foul trouble, I wouldn't be surprised. But generally speaking, the word about the Thunder is that they are going to be patient. They are not going to rush anything, even more so than what I was just saying about Philadelphia, and that there is real value in waiting to see what this group looks like in the playoffs. Could they make it even 2 rounds in and get like a 8 to 12 game sample size to like really see different lineups against different types of personnel? If they get the Phoenix Suns in one round and Denver in another, for example, like that's just 2 very, very different makeups. Right. And you could gauge and really evaluate what you've got depending on those types of situations. I think with Minnesota, they're much more clear who they are. This is kind of like a small window here where the point, like, I wouldn't fault anyone in the Wolves front office if they are thinking, shit, we might have a 1-year window here, like before all the salary stuff hits the fan. Let's just like go get a backup guard right now that can really help us get there. I'm not saying they think that, because obviously Anthony Edwards is young, McDaniels is young, but like the other end of their core, Rudy Gobert and Mike Conley are like clearly not long for the ride as long as Anthony Edwards is. So I do think the Wolves have like really pinpointed, we are looking at the top tier reserve guards that we can to really supplant our offense when Mike Conley's on the bench.
Last one for me, Jake. 2 guys that whose names keep floating around who I think could swing the title this year are Miles Bridges and Bruce Brown. Now, obviously, there's a lot of baggage attached to Miles Bridges. Bruce Brown is a guy that won a title last year. What is the latest on those 2 guys, and who are the teams that seem to be targeting both of them?
So the teams for Miles Bridges that I have heard are Detroit, Utah, and Phoenix, where Phoenix has clearly a ton of Michigan State connections, where Matt Ishbia was part of the same program, the same Tom Izzo program that Miles Bridges came from. They only have the really Nasir Little and second-round picks to trade, and it seems like Charlotte is hoping for a higher return. So I'll have more about that coming at Yahoo today, but I'm curious to see if there actually is a deal to be had there between Phoenix and Charlotte. For Bruce Brown, the Raptors are looking for a first-round pick as well, and maybe even more. And I think they're going to have a long list of teams that are interested. The teams that come up the most for me have been the Lakers, the Knicks. I think the Knicks and Bruce Brown make perfect sense for each other. He fits. I mean, he might be like one of another thing that the Knicks have, but like they already have a bunch of 6'4", 6'5" switchable dogs who just are all over the Madison Square Garden floor, and I think he'd fit in really, really well with what Tom Thibodeau likes to do there. I also would be curious to see if Milwaukee does decide that Bobby Portis is a necessary sacrifice to make in their quest to upgrade on their perimeter defense. I don't think they have.
Man.
I mean, they don't have the same level of draft capital that New York has, or even that the Lakers have. But the Bucks, to my understanding, are like very, very actively and aggressively shopping to find perimeter defensive upgrades. And there might not be anyone better who's actually available than Bruce Brown.
Last one for me, Jake. I just want to ask you real quick about the Indiana Pacers. I know they already made a big move by getting Siakam. I just think they're a lot closer than people think to really being scary for some of those top teams because of their style of play with a superstar, point guard that makes everybody better on the floor. I think Mathurin is still an emerging guy as part of a big three, but they're also a team I think that could use a little bit more length and size defensively, that can guard multiple positions and guard those guards. DeAndre Hunter's a name I've heard come up. Do you think Indiana is still in the market to do something else, or is this pretty much the Siakam move was it for them, and now they'll get to the summer and reevaluate?
Yeah, I think DeAndre Hunter was one of the many names, from him to Tobias Harris to Andrew Wiggins and Jonathan Kuminga. I mean, go down the list of forwards that Indiana has been looking for 3 years now, basically, to plug into that lineup between Tyrese Halliburton and Miles Turner that I think did ultimately end with Pascal Siakam. I've heard stuff about, can they still look to maybe make a consolidation trade, being that Jarris Walker was already buried on the bench behind Obi Toppin and Jalen Smith and Isaiah Jackson. So I'll be curious to see if Indiana does look to make one more. Okay, can we take these three players and turn them into one or two into one? But they've been quiet of late. Again, another team that I'm definitely have written down as I want to find out more about them as we get closer to Thursday, because it has been pretty quiet about the Pacers since they went out and got Pascal.
Jake, I know it's a busy week for you. Thanks for taking some time. Plug, you got the show coming up later on. What time is the show and what's going on with it?
Well, we already recorded Good Word with Goodwill today, so it's just about editing and publishing. That'll come out on the Ball Don't Lie podcast feed. We've got Divine Intervention, with Dan Divine on Tuesday, and then me and Dan on our show, No Cap Room, again, all on the Ball Don't Lie podcast. That comes out Thursday. We're recording that like right as the deadline's ending, so it's going to be instant reaction. Maybe I'll get little tidbits along the way as we're recording, and we're going to have a bunch of different stuff all week long, as we do every week on the Ball Don't Lie podcast. Yeah.
One of the best in the biz. And of course, his book, Built to Lose. Check that out. You can pull it up again, Emma, for us. Jake, thanks so much for joining us. Have a good one.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate the hospitality.
Thanks,